Hey, it's Michael. Welcome back to another episode of the follow-up question. To kick off this episode, I've got a question for you. When was the last time you had a really good conversation with a complete stranger? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through our culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, and how to listen and give space so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for, rather than what we are against. In 2015, Rob Lawless was working as a sales rep. And if you've ever been in the sales world, you know that part of the job is to call people at random and see if they want to hop on the phone with you for a conversation about your product or service. It's called cold calling, and if you've ever done it, you know it is not fun. It sucks. But this was Rob's job day in and day out, and as you might expect, not a lot of people wanted to talk with Rob. In fact, some of the responses he got were kind of downright nasty, and that's really not a fun way to go about your life, let alone how you make a living. So there he is in 2015, and Rob decides to try something different, aside from his job. He wonders if he could just meet with random people to chat about them, to chat about their lives, the things that they care about, for an hour each, just to see how the conversations went. And wouldn't you know it, far more people were open and willing to have that conversation than when Rob was fulfilling his sales role duties. But it was the beginning of an incredible project that now is almost a decade old. You see, those first phone calls in November 2015 were the creation of what is now known as Rob's 10K Friends. Rob is my guest here on this episode, and he's on a mission to have 10,000 one-hour conversations with complete strangers over the next however many years it takes him to get that done. And that is what we talk about in this episode, when he anticipates getting that done. But what you're about to hear, this conversation, I'm one of those 10,000. In fact, I'm conversation number 6,140. And my conversation with Rob here on this episode is not your typical interview that you're probably used to hearing on this show, although I do ask a lot of questions because it's just in my nature. But this is really just a conversation in Rob's model of, hey, we're strangers. Let's talk to each other and see if we can gain a little bit wider perspective on the world. There are some fantastic insights from Rob that comes out of this. He's got some things that he's noticed about how we communicate with each other and the longing that we have as human beings to want to be known and seen and heard that I think make a lot of sense to bring to this show. Perhaps most importantly is this idea that when we're sitting and having conversations with each other and we are simply discussing our views, our ideas, the things we care about, oftentimes what goes unsaid is that yes, there are challenges, yes, there are problems, yes, there are issues, but that we don't always need to feel so pulled to try and solve them. Sometimes we just need to share them and be heard. if I could start by asking you a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you have done this many multiple thousands of times, jumped on these calls, jumped on these conversations. I got to
Hmm.
believe you've got a good way to start a conversation. So
Sure.
how do you start your conversations now?
Very simply, just by asking like, where are you calling in from? Which I'm curious about because I'm calling in from Philadelphia,
Yeah.
and I used to meet everyone in person for my project. I started it in November 2015, and still, when I meet people in person, it's like, are you from Philly originally, or are you from? If I'm in Los Angeles, LA originally, because I always say like the location piece gives you a starting point for someone's story,
Yeah.
and then you can kind of see how it's evolved over time. So, yeah, but now when COVID happened, I started doing virtual calls. So I've met people from like 90 plus countries around the world, and I don't do a lot of research on people before I meet them. I just set up the time and then hang. So it's like last week, a girl was like, "Oh, I'm calling you from Switzerland, but I'm from Estonia." One of the guys that I talked to is from lives in the Maldives. So I was like, "Okay, tell me where." And I spent like 5 minutes trying to find his specific location on the map. And so I'm learning about the connected islands of the Maldives and stuff. So long-winded answer to, yeah, location is what I start with.
How many are you up to now? How many of these conversations have you done?
So you are number 6,140, 6140.
6140. All right.
Yeah.
How
And
ma- how many do you average like a week?
I would, so it's interesting now because I like speaking, so I do the project full time. I started it November 2015. I took it full time 8 months later. I was working for a tech startup that was acquired, so I was laid off, and then I jumped into this full time, and I just was surviving for a long time. And then in April of 2021, I did my first paid speaking engagement, and this Thursday will be my 50th paid speaking engagement. So it's become
Amazing.
like a bigger part of my life, and that's how I support myself now. So I'm traveling a lot for that. Like last week I was in Phoenix, Arizona. This week I'll be in Florida. Next week I'll be in Iowa. The week after that I'll be back in Florida. So I'm losing like 2 days a week to travel for speaking, which is obviously worth it because now I can pay rent. But uh, I'm trying. Like I want to from here on out. I want to do like 500 a year, an average of 500 a year. Because if I do that, then I'll finish the project by the time I'm 40, like
Yep.
in my 40th year.
Yep.
And I just think that sounds really cool to say I met 10,000 people by the time I was 40. And yeah, and then like if it takes me to like 42, it's no big deal. Like it's not like I'm going to be upset if I don't hit it at 40, but that's kind of like the unofficial quota that I have right now. Last year I met like 697 people. This year, it's looking like it's gonna be close to get to 500 because you I try to schedule 4 people a day when I'm not traveling, but that doesn't necessarily mean that 4 people are gonna show up every day, so you're kind of at the whim of other people's schedules, which I'm sure you understand with podcasting.
For sure. how
Yeah.
how often do you get ghosted?
All the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, last year I was keeping track of it last year because it was frustrating me, and I just wanted to see, like, how much further would I be along in this project. I would definitely be over 7,000 people at this point. Like, I've definitely had at least, like, 1,000 people cancel last minute or not show. Last Friday, I had 4 people scheduled. The one woman the night before, she's like, "Hey, I'm sick. I can't make it tomorrow." I wake up at that morning, and the person who I was supposed to meet at 1 PM is like, "Hey, I got stuck at work. I have a meeting now. I can't do it at that time." And you can't go to these people and be like, "No, you gotta tell work that you gotta hang out with me for no reason." Like, I understand where I fit. So, yeah, but it's always interesting because those cancellations are adding people in my life 7 years from now that I otherwise wouldn't have met. So it's a very interesting it's like it's working out how it's supposed to.
Sure. That's incredible, man.
Yeah. Yeah. So how long have you been in Denver? I'm gonna be there at the end of March.
Since you started this project, 2015.
Oh, okay.
And if you are in Denver, man, I would love to connect with you in person. That's always so much better. Anytime I get a chance to speak to in person to somebody who has been on the show, you just putting a face to the name, putting a physical person in front of you to the person that you've only met through the computer screen is
Sure.
incredible. I met one of my podcast guests just a couple weeks ago at a Denver Nuggets basketball game.
Oh,
He
nice.
was in town for business, and he came in as well, and he got a ticket to the game, and we met at halftime, and it was just so awesome to shake his hand.
Yeah.
It was great meeting him in person. So
That's awesome. So, um, what took like okay, so if we think about like I grew up in Philly, I went to Penn State.
yep.
I studied finance. I did consulting for Deloitte in Philly for a year and 3 months, and then I did the tech startup, which was also in Philly. So then I moved into the city for that job. And then I was in Philly from June of 2015 to June of 2017. So that was like the time that I started the project and I took it full time. And then in June of 2017, I went to Los Angeles to live with my college roommate who was able to host me for
Mhm.
free. So I was there for 3 months and then back in Philly for 5 months and then back in LA for 9 months in 2018 and then back in Philly for 4 months, back in LA for 3 months in 2019, back in Philly for 2 months, and then I went to Hoboken, New Jersey for 9 months. Then I went back to my parents for the majority of COVID and then back into the city in January of 22. So that's like the evolution of where I've been based location wise. Did
Yeah.
you go straight from Kansas City to Denver or were there spots in between?
Yeah, I grew up in Kansas City, went to Kansas State University,
Mm.
little connection to Penn State. James Franklin, Penn State's football coach, was K-State's offensive coordinator back in 2006, 7. So for one season, he he coached
Oh,
at
okay,
Kansas
nice.
State.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, so I grew up there, grew up in Kansas all my life, lived on the Missouri side for about a year. Or for a hot second when we moved back from Manhattan, Kansas, where Kansas State is, to Kansas City. I went to go work at a tech startup in Kansas City at that time, and then from there, moved out here to Denver and have been here, like I said, since 2015. And I came out here for work. Family followed, came along with me, of course, and we've been
okay,
here almost, gosh, coming up on 10 years now, just a year
okay.
away.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So
Wow,
I'm
so what did go ahead.
I'm curious, Rob. Like you're you're doing speaking now. I'm a speaker coach, kind of on the side.
Oh,
Um,
okay,
I'm the head speaker coach for a TEDx event. I help with other speaking events like Disrupt HR and TEDx Boulder around the Denver area. I'm curious how you made that happen. Like, when did people start knocking on your door through this project? I know you've done hits on, like, I think Good Morning America and
mhm,
some other places, but um, yeah, when did people start knocking on your door and be like, "Will you talk to us about this?"
yeah. Well, I did a TEDx talk in April of 2021, and then I did my first paid speech that same month. A girl from my project was a student at the University of Washington, and they had like a global case competition. So I think she knew that I was trying to get into speaking, or like in COVID, that December 2020, I started hosting a seminar to teach people how I got to know people. So I'd be like, it's going to be Sunday from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Join the call. I'll teach you how to get to know people. I'll break you out into pairs with people so you can share your story and meet other people from around the world. And then I asked people afterwards, like, just donate whatever you felt the value was. And also, can you give me feedback, like testimonials? Because eventually, and I believed it, but maybe half heartedly at the time, like, eventually I want to take this to colleges and universities and corporations. And then I did do that in May of 2021. I got laryngitis. So
Hmm.
I couldn't talk for my meetings. Like, it was the first time in my life that it wasn't just a sore or a hoarse voice. It was like it hurt to talk, and I felt like I was doing damage to my voice by trying to have conversations. So, and I was staying in Hoboken at the time with my two friends. I had just come back from a month in LA, and I was kind of quarantining with my friends in Hoboken before I went back to my parents. And I put out on my Instagram account, like, "Hey, I have a goal to book 10 engagements by August." And this was in May. And I just said, "Who do I need to talk to at your organization or whatever?" And a guy from my project was like, "Oh, you should speak at Pepperdine. Like, here's who you should talk to." And a girl who followed me was like, "You should speak at Auburn." And woman who I had met was on a DEI team for Amazon, and she's like, "I've been thinking about having you come speak to us ever since we met." So it was like me vocalizing that this is something that I want to do and get into, so my audience could be like, "Oh, I can help him with this." So it was really that time. I see that as being a pivotal moment because it back then, I'm sure you know this too. In the start, everyone's like, "Okay, where have you spoken? What
Yeah.
have they said?" So, I would always just try to be as big as I could be in that moment and be like, "Oh, I'm talking to these 5 schools about them wanting to bring me in, and here's me on Kelly Clarkson's talk show and Ryan Seacrest's radio show, and people are talking about me," and then I would do, like, a gig, and I'd be like, "I've spoken at Pepperdine, this is what they said, and I'm talking to these 5 schools, and here's me on Kelly Clarkson, Ryan Seacrest, and blah, blah, blah." And then I would just move, it over, and every time I would speak, I would post on LinkedIn, and then people were like, "Oh, we have this inclusion event coming up. I saw that you've been speaking. We think you'd be a good speaker for us." And it was still like a very slow, like, you know how it goes. It's a very slow build. And another pivotal moment was 2 Decembers ago. I went to a boot camp for a company called Impact 11, and they teach about like the business of speaking, and they bring in people who are from the bureau side to give insights to speakers of how do you get connected to them. And I emailed every single person, attendee and speaker who was at that thing afterwards, just to thank them for sharing their time. And one of the women was this woman, Kelly, and she, in her LinkedIn profile, talked about how much she liked human connection. And I said, "Oh, it's a shame we didn't get to chat with each other because you probably would have really liked my project." And then I invited her to be part of it. She had to cancel 2 times. The 3rd time we met, and as I was telling, like you said, disrupt HR. So I kind of got a foot in the door by applying to and getting accepted to SHRM.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
those were some of the early stages that I got to be on that led to paid gigs. But I told her, I was like, "Yeah, I spoke at SHRM at their annual event last year, and my room was filled the first day, and the second day they had to turn people away at the door because they didn't have enough space." And when she heard that, she was like, "I think I can help you, and I think I can work with you." So then worked with her to get my website up to speed, my demo reel, and all that stuff. And from there, like we're now starting to catch with us working together. Like I did 14 gigs total last year. I have 20 already booked for this year, and hopefully we'll add a lot more as the year goes along. But that's been a little bit of the journey.
Amazing, man. Amazing, Rob.
Yeah.
You know, since this is a podcast, like my podcast is called the follow up question. I just have so many questions I want to ask you. I want to make
Yeah.
sure I'm not like dominating the conversation here,
Do
but
no, do whatever.
I've
Yeah.
got to ask, like, and I do want this to be, more of the conversation like you're used to, but
Mm,
um, something you said, and I think it's actually in your demo reel. You're on a stage. You said the more I interact with the depth of people, the more I acknowledge that it exists. And I've got to believe that you have figured out some things that are true about communication, about interacting with people. Now that you were at 6,000 plus meetings like this, um, what are those things? I'm curious, Rob. Like, what have you learned and found out about communication? And I want to put it in the context of this. I don't believe we were taught to communicate well in our formal schooling and our formal training of what it means to communicate. It's been a like I have the answer. Communication with somebody you disagree with is always framed as debate. Uh, there's a winner and a loser. There's a right and a wrong. That's what I'm on this. That's what I'm producing this show to help us work through. Is what are the things about communication that you were never
mm,
taught?
yeah.
What have you found out? What have you have found to be true about communication and all these conversations that you're having?
Yeah. To build on to those last points you made, I think you have to go in, especially if you're meeting new people, understanding that there's a possibility that you may be wrong. The way that you grew up may not be the right way. It could be like, I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic school for 12 years, and you're taught like that's the right religion, right? And then
Mhm.
this is what you need to get to heaven and stuff. And then you talk to someone who's from Saudi Arabia, and they grow up in a very predominantly Muslim country, and it's like, I don't know if I'd be Catholic if I was born in Saudi Arabia. Like, I'd probably be Muslim, right? And so you start to understand that a lot of your experiences are just your experiences, and what you believe in is a product of your life experiences and the people that you've been conditioned by and all this different stuff. So I think that's always helped me in terms of my communication is going in with an open mind. And because I think in arguments, a lot of times people are like, okay, I want to hear you so I can process it and then explain to you why you're wrong. Right?
It's so
In-
true.
Instead of being like, I want to hear you and I want to process it. And I would think maybe I could be wrong in this situation.
Yeah.
And same with like politics and stuff. People, they're always like listening to prove them wrong. And I think you, you have to look at it. I like to put myself on the other side of the table in the other person's shoes, looking back at me and kind of evaluate it in that sense. But yeah, so having the open mind, I think, is a really big thing when it comes to communication and coming to the table with respect too. I've met so many people, and I'm just not a confrontational person. I hate confrontation. So I've met so many people who I disagree with, and I would have conversations with them and be like, "Yeah, like I see where you're coming from," and then they would give into my points and be like, "Yeah, well, I see this too," and it's just like you give, and then you get to a point of understanding instead of battling because then you're just defending and putting your heels into the ground even more. But yeah, all of that's kind of one thing. But I think also the biggest thing I've learned from my project, I always say, is no one really knows what they're doing with their lives.
Hmm.
Everyone's just doing the best they can with the resources that they have. And I think that was a huge learning lesson for me. And especially like I was 24 when I started the project and in that post grad time of my life. And I think inevitably at every point we look at the people around us and think, well, everyone else has this figured out. And I feel like I don't have it figured out. Everyone else knows what they want to do for their job after school. Everyone else knows how to handle having two kids and do like be awake and alert at work. And I think it's just like no one, including you, knows what they're doing. And when you understand that, you can give yourself a little bit more space and freedom and take some of that pressure off of your shoulders. And I think that's just helpful in one, being able to relate to other people, but two, being able to be kind to yourself. And the last thing is in terms of communication, like in my talks, I talk about this friend framework. It comes from Ford, which is the Ford framework is family, occupation, recreation, and dreams. And my manager was like, well, we should make this more branded towards you so you can kind of run with it. So just altered it to friend. So it's like family and relationships, like including friendships. And I is industry and E is entertainment. What do you like to do outside of work? And ND is your needs and dreams. What are your dreams for the future and what do you need to get there? And it doesn't matter if you're from Iran or Brazil or Latvia or Kenya. It doesn't matter where you're from, like you have a family dynamic. It might look different, but you have a family dynamic that has an impact on who you are emotionally. You have some type of like industry career path. All of us at one point or another went to some type of education and have some way that we need to pay the bills as adults. And we all have things that we enjoy outside of work that make us who we are. And we all have dreams for what we want for our future. So I think, especially when I started talking to people from around the world, it's like you can't get outside of those themes. You can't be a person that doesn't have a family dynamic, right? You might not have immediate family anymore, but you still have a family dynamic. So that kind of like bonded humanity for me, seeing that every single one of us has those categories applied to our lives. And it's the details that either look similar or different.
That's awesome, man. I love that. it it there are so many elements of that that fit into the framework that I wrote my book about. My book
Mhm.
is "Can I Ask a Question?" And in that, I present my um, framework of conflict communication in particular. I call it the ask then see approach to communication. Ask is to get you in the right mindset to go into a conversation. So it's assume positive intent is the A. The S is set aside your ego, and the K is know that you don't know everything and simply can't, right? So much of what you were just saying kind of flows into that ask part of that framework. Because the C then is, if you can get yourself in the right mindset of assuming positive intent, setting aside your ego, and knowing that you don't know everything, then when you are challenged with a different idea, when you are challenged with something that doesn't jive with your experiences, like you just said, you begin to the first S is, it's basically ask questions of yourself. Search yourself is the first S. Search yourself. Ask questions of yourself. Dig in and understand how your experience fueled how you see the world. The first E then is explore other viewpoints. Go and get curious in your mind. You're still up in your mind, but start asking questions about others. Just say, well, if that's my experience, then somebody who lived in Saudi Arabia, how might they experience the world a little bit differently than me, or maybe completely differently than me? And how does that affect their worldview on this issue or this thing that we're discussing, or this contentious thing that we're debating, perhaps? And then the final E is exchange your curiosity with others. Go and actually ask questions of someone. And if your world group is so small that you don't have anyone you disagree with to go ask questions of, then you've limited yourself. You've created such a narrow perception of reality. That's why that quote from your speaker reel spoke to me. The more I interact with the depth of people, the more I acknowledge that it exists. Man, I love that, because that's exchanging your curiosity. And if you don't know that doesn't exist, then your world's too small. Your world is too small, man. So
Yeah,
I love that. I love everything you just said, because it jives so much with what I'm trying to, I guess, preach here on this show and in my
yeah,
book.
likewise, and I love that too. It's such a good way to think about it too. I feel like it's like we're preaching to each other and both loving the message we're hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're both drinking the
Um,
Kool-Aid.
yeah. But it's cool, and I'm happy you liked that quote from the demo there. Have you ever heard of the book The Happiness Advantage by Sean Aker?
Yes.
So, if you remember in the book, he talks about the Tetris effect, where they had people play Tetris for hours on end, and then they studied them, and they noticed when they'd go to the grocery store, they'd be like, "This cereal box should fit next to the fruit snacks," or like they started to see the world through the lens of Tetris because they were playing so much Tetris. And he said the same thing happens if you're pessimistic or optimistic. If you're
Mm.
pessimistic all the time, you start to view the world through a negative lens. And then you find all that negative stuff to reinforce your belief that the world is a bad place. And if you look at it through a positive lens, then the same thing happens. You start to see the good that reinforces your belief that the world is a good place. And that's what I was thinking about with like the more that I meet people and understand their story for an hour, aka play Tetris with them, the more that I could see a stranger on the sidewalk and be like, that person has a story that I could get to know for an hour. Or someone who cuts me off on traffic, that person has
Yeah.
a story. And it's yeah, it's the word sonder. Are you familiar with it?
Sonder?
Hmm.
Mm-mm.
It's like a fake word. It comes from this book, The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, which is some guy that made words for emotions that he felt didn't have definitions or nouns for them or whatever, adjectives. So sonder is it's defined as the realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own, populated with their own friends, routines, worries, ambitions, and inherited craziness.
Hmm.
And that's what I think of. And there's like a really beautiful video of it on YouTube, and it's like they may for you in your life, they may just be like a lighted window at dusk, or they might be a car on the highway. And it fascinates me. Like if you are in the city in Denver and you see like a lit up window, there's an entire universe there. And like that, yeah, I love that. And I think that plays a lot into what I do.
I've had those same thoughts on the highway. Like, driving in traffic down I-25 here in Denver. It's always packed, but like
Hmm.
every single person in every single car that you go by or that passes you, they're going somewhere. And that
Hmm.
amazes me. Like if you just stop and think about it, like they're going somewhere because there's something that they have to do, or there's an experience that they're trying to have. Here in Denver, it's usually they're heading up into the mountains to go skiing, but
Yeah.
uh It is. It's fascinating to think of not just, oh, that person passed me, but just even for a split second, be like, I wonder where they're going. I wonder what
Mhm.
they're up to today. I wonder how their
Yeah.
life is. Like you can start to, I mean, it can be overwhelming, no doubt, if you do that
Mhm.
a lot. But going back to what you said about the Tetris and the optimist and the pessimist and how you see things. There was an author here on and a university professor here on the show, Dominic Packer. He wrote the book Power of Us with Jay Van Bavel, and they talk about the importance of priming. Like even just priming ourselves to be optimistic, even priming ourselves to be a part of a collective rather than an individual, can set us up to have better relationships and better interactions with people. Like
Mhm.
the study that I quote that came from their book all the time just fascinates me. University students in universities in England, I believe, they were there was one group who were told to think of themselves as the larger group of university students out there in the world. We are university students. We're all going through this experience of university together. The other group was to think of themselves as students of that university in particular. Like we are students at this place. Then they brought in a smelly t-shirt of a rival institution to that university. And the people who were primed to think of themselves as part of the global student population, Rob, they literally thought the stinky t-shirt smelled, I guess, better, less gross than the people who were primed to think of themselves as students of that university because that was their rival.
Mhm.
So even
Yeah.
just priming yourself to think like an optimist, priming yourself to think like a human being, like part of a greater plan, not this niche group that you've identified with. I talk a lot about tribalisms here on the show. Like, yes, we all need and love and want our tribes. Part of your friend framework is family and relationships, right? That's hugely important to us. But in the grander scheme of things, getting ourselves out of that and priming ourselves to think of ourselves as optimists with hope, so much of that is so important in what we do when we talk about communicating with others. I hope I'm drawing some parallels there that make sense.
Yeah, definitely. And, it makes me think too, because you were saying, like, if you don't have anyone that you can disagree with, your your bubble is too small.
Yeah.
Like, it's and there's another word from that same book, and it's called onism, and the definition of it is the awareness of how little of the world you'll experience.
Mm,
And that one struck me just as much as the Sonder word because I've learned through my project that it's like the more I meet people, the more I realize how little I know about the world. And then it's like it makes me think about like it's a weird relationship where when I knew less people, I thought I knew more about the world. Now I know more people and I know less about the world because I've just gotten to that place of awareness.
yeah.
And it makes you think if the average life expectancy is like 80 years old or whatever, and you have this whole world that you could explore, like this whole thing, you can go out and try different foods and interact with different cultures and read about other religions and stuff. But like you have an 80-minute or 80-year time limit to do this before you go off to whatever is next. And in the book they say like if you were to die and someone asked you like, hey, what was Earth like? The only honest answer would be to say, I don't know. I passed through one time. Like you couldn't give
Hmm.
an accurate answer as to what it and that has kind of scared me into continuing to be passionate. Not that I ever lost the passion, but being even more passionate about my project because I'm like, okay, at least I'm not wasting the time. I'm seeing what life is like from this perspective and from that perspective. And yeah, I think more people should think in that way where they're like, what it's like an adventure, like go out and have fun with it.
Have you heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect?
No.
So what you just described in your understanding of the world really flows into this. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is our level of confidence in how much we know about something and how much we actually know about it. So for so many people, it's charted out. You can look it up. When they first learn a little bit about something, they have an overinflated confidence about how much they actually know. And that plagues us a lot in a society of headline readers and 280 characters. Like, we know so little and think we know all we need to know. As we begin to actually learn more, as we begin to have more experiences, as we begin to bring in more facts about this thing, our confidence in what we know plummets. It falls off a cliff when we realize, I thought I knew everything that there was to know here, and I don't know anything close to enough. And then you come out of it. Then you begin to experience more and learn more and start to piece together and tie together strings of information. And you get to what is at the top. It's called this kind of plateau of it's the cliff of ignorance and the plateau of enlightenment, I believe is what it's called, where you come out of it and you're like, okay, I don't know everything, but I know more than I used to, and that's a good thing. And I want to keep learning more rather than just getting to this point where I think I know everything, because you can't possibly, because you've been through that dip of, I have no idea what's going on here. I thought I knew and I have no idea. It's really fascinating stuff. And you reminded me of that with the more you have these interactions around the world, the less you feel like you know. I can't
Yeah,
imagine.
I'm definitely yeah. I mean, it happens all the time, but that is making me think like I'm definitely going to look into that because a lot of the speaking that I do, it's like how do you create connection in the workplace, or how did last week I spoke at an event like how do you deepen your relationships with your staff? And I would bet so many leaders are on that ignorant confidence of like, well, I had a conversation about their personal life a couple times, and so I know about them.
Yeah.
If they were to learn more, they'd fall off. And yeah, that's super important. What why I'm curious, like obviously we both care about connection and widening our perspectives and whatnot.
Yeah.
Why do you think that you have gotten to care more about it than the average person? Like what from your life has put you into that place?
Um, I was just a podcast that I was on recently just released, and I actually recorded it last summer. So it's been 6, 7+ months since I actually said it, but I went back and listened to it, and I said some things in there that I'd never shared before. Um, so there's like the surface level answer, which is, um, I was right outside this door here. I was sitting on the couch with my wife. We were watching the news. It was summer of 2020, and the election was going on. Um, the riots were happening in the wake of the George Floyd murders. Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and just everything had come to a head there. Of course, the pandemic was going on, and I just had this nagging feeling that this isn't who we are. Like, this is not the interactions that I have with people on a day in and day out basis. The people that I interact with, I can have conversations with people that disagree with me, but it never gets to this point. And so, kind of like you, a stereotypical millennial, I started a podcast. Like, I think I saw on your website, you said like stereotypical millennial. I went to work at a tech startup and started this project. So we're pretty similar there, Rob. That's kind of my surface level answer. Like, I just felt like, gosh, I don't feel like this is who we are, and I want to do something about it, but what the heck can I do? So I started a podcast. I'm a former journalist, and I just said, I know how to interview people. It's one of the things that I'm best at. I'm just going to do that and see if I can find some common ground. And over time, that eventually turned into like, look, there's a lack of our ability to communicate, especially across differences, that I've really leaned into. But Rob, the true, the honest, the deep answer is I've had relationships affected by our inability to communicate, and in negative ways. And like, it's been my fault. It's not just been other people's fault. It's been my fault too. I've lost jobs. I have lost relationships. I've had arguments that were really, really uncomfortable, and lost friendships because of it, because of some of this stuff, like our inability to communicate, our inability to see somebody else's lived experience as not as their truth, not the truth, capital T, but their truth, and how important that is to invite in, especially when we disagree. And it was honestly like perhaps it was like a selfish act of like, I don't want to have those conversations anymore. I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to lose these relationships anymore. I'm scared to lose more relationships or put my family in an awkward position. Like, just I think at the end of the day, it's because it affected me too, in really deep, meaningful ways. And I mentioned my book earlier. One of the things that has driven me about writing the book was somebody somewhere along the way told me, like, we write the book that we need first. And
Mhm.
I think it was pretty similar with this podcast. Like, I started the podcast that I needed first. I wasn't a patient guy. I wasn't a very um, inquisitive guy. Yeah, I was as a journalist because that was my job, but to understand people's experiences, like, I needed that in my life too. And that kind of spurred all of this, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. What would you say is the difference between, in your experience and maybe like the way you felt about it and stuff, of journalism versus your own podcast for your own reasons?
hmm Um, really similar, actually. Uh, I will say, when I was a journalist, one of the dirty little secrets of the journalism world that maybe is not so dirty and little anymore is reporters are biased. Like, we all have our biases, and as much as we try to toe the middle ground, more often than not, a reporter goes into a story not with an air of curiosity, but with a story already in their mind, and they're just seeking confirmation. So confirmation bias in the journalism world is high. And I wasn't a hard news reporter. I was a sports writer, but it was very much the same. I became attached to the teams that I cover. I wanted them to win. Covering a winner is always easier than covering a loser. Those interviews go much easier when a team has won versus lost. But I did do some news reporting, and it's the same thing. Like, we're human, and inviting that in and understanding that. And I wish more reporters would be open and honest and upfront about that. Like, hey, um, this is how I approached this, but I want you to know I did this to try and confront my bias, rather than acting like reporters are completely unbiased and incapable of it.
Mhm.
Uh,
Sure.
which I think is what we journalists sometimes run into trouble with, is trying to prove our unbias when in actuality admitting our bias would get us a lot further down the road.
Mm.
Um, One of the things that I've tried to do is invite a really wide range of people on this show. Um, and I actually had a friend one time who was like, "You should really lean into the fact that you have a really diverse audience." And I told her at the time, "I love the fact that you recognize it and I don't have to say it." But that has also brought in some really uncomfortable conversations for me. I have said many times that I enjoy the fact that I sometimes get pushback, or have gotten pushback in the past, that people think that I agree with every guest that comes on the show, and I don't. Almost every guest says something I disagree with, and and but I like that you don't know what it is. And I'll admit, I've admitted stuff about myself and some of my own personal biases many, many times on the show, to speak to what I just talked about earlier with journalists. But I want other people's voices heard more than mine, first and foremost. I don't know if that answers your question, Rob.
Yeah, no, it's good, and yeah, I would say that my project is probably run in a similar way, because there's a difference. Again, like, I'm not trying to disprove people.
Yeah.
You're, like, giving them the floor and saying, "Let me hear you and process it," and then you might reflect on it after that podcast or that call, and think about what you do and don't agree with, and I've had great conversations with everyone that I've ever met. Does that mean that I wanna hang out with everyone that I've ever met again? No, like, there's personalities
Right.
that I don't get along with, and we're good for an hour. We probably wouldn't be good for 10 hours together, but I also like that aspect that you could be good with an hour with anyone for an hour if you're bringing respect to the table.
Yeah.
How when did you start your podcast again?
2020, July 2020.
Oh, okay. So how many
Yeah.
episodes are you in?
Just as of recording this, 121 released every other week. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm curious, something I found in running this show and having these conversations, and like you said, bringing that respect to the table and giving other people the floor. Um, it has been therapeutic for a lot of my guests. Do you find other people find the chance that somebody's just like you, just curious about them has been a release valve for people?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I've had people tell me it's like free therapy,
Yeah.
and I would say it is for me too. Because doing
Yeah.
my project full time, like, in 2018, I had $500 left, and that was a stressful time financially, and I would just tell people, like, "Hey, this is what I'm where I'm at." Not to have them solve it in any way, but because it helped me if it was not just up in my head,
Mhm.
but it was out in the world and I could bounce it off of people, and so it's like, I don't think people realize how much I lean on them as well, and not in any, like, major way, but in a very subtle way of just, yeah, getting out of my head and into the world, and I think they do the same. I talked with a woman last week who she's 57, she's getting her master's in counseling right now, and she was cool because when she spoke to me, she was like, "I don't know why I did this, I just felt like maybe my story could help someone." And I was like, "Yeah, it could, because there's so many people out there who, 'Oh, I'd love to get my master's, but I'm too old.' Or, 'I'd love to shift into this career, but I'm too old.' And
Yeah.
here's an example of someone doing it who's really enjoying it." But her story was not easy. Like, she was telling me about her daughter was born in 1998, and she, like, felt called to go see her parents and her brother, in 2001, and she was like 10 days before she was supposed to go out there, her brother hung himself.
Mm.
And we just sat there with that information, and I let her process it as she was telling it to me, and I gotten better at holding space for people, as I'm sure you have. And she didn't tell me that for me to solve it in any way. She was telling me it to share it, and then she, like, made it through and just shared how that impacted her life and stuff, and her daughter was born with special needs and required a lot of care, and then she had her son, and she dealt with postpartum depression after her son. So she had this very challenging 10-year stretch, and she's telling me all about it. But there are cool things too. She said that, and she's big into her faith, she said that the depression for her was like this fog, and she was like, and sometimes the light at the end of the tunnel was only as big as a pinprick, but it was always there.
Yeah.
And that pinprick grew into something bigger, and her faith helped her, and now she's in this place of wanting to go out and help other people. So, yeah, I think I have been a therapist for a lot of people, whether they knew it or not, and it is part of it's just I think it's interesting too, the angle that we're talking, like, again, it's a different relationship where they're not coming to me for me to solve their problems or give them tips for mental health. They're just talking to the perfect stranger who's gonna have no bias towards them or no, like, judgment with where they fit in their family and stuff like that. Like, I'm not a good friend of theirs that's gonna go tell their parent or any of that. But, yeah, it's just the facts of people's lives. Like, life is unfair to a lot of people, and so it's really just them telling me their stories, and their stories just happen to have traumatic pieces to them.
I wrote that down. Sometimes people come to us, they don't with problems they don't need us to solve. They just need to share. I wrote that down, man.
Mhm.
So good stuff there. And I don't know that I've ever voiced this here on the show, but it's something my wife and I talk a lot about. I think through trauma, through sharing trauma, or through sharing pain experienced, I think that is actually how we best relate to people. Like if you are like the strongest bond people can share is through shared pain and shared trauma. And not that I want that to happen for people, but I think that is just simply a a, a feature of the human experience.
Mhm.
And that is where the deepest love, the deepest support, the deepest um, ability to connect with people, the deepest connections are made when we can
Mhm.
acknowledge and share that pain with each other. And to not admit that it exists blocks us from being able to have those shared connections.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, even with like marriage and stuff, I'm single, so I don't know, you know better than I do, but I feel like going through a trial or tribulation with that person, that's like, it makes you that much stronger than if you get into a relationship and it's all sunshine and rainbows the whole time.
It can happen in a marriage if it doesn't devolve into blaming the other person for the trauma and the
Mm,
pain.
yeah.
And that is and believing that other person is there to get you out of your trauma and pain. I have found, and this is my belief, the more we can show up selflessly in a marriage or in a relationship, the more we will actually get our needs met and our pain healed. Far too often, we look to the other person to do that work for us, when in actuality, we would be far. And of course, sometimes we need help. There's nuance, and this is not a binary black and white. But I see far too many relationships ended because just listen to the language people use when they first are in that love or infatuation stage. Um, well, she makes me feel this way, or I've never been happier with around her because of everything that she does, or all that, that kind of language.
Yeah.
Um, I believe the point of marriage or the point of a relationship is to be in selfless service to that person, that the act of love towards them generates love in return. And far too
Mhm.
many people want that love to be able to give love.
Mm.
Again, not always binary. Certain circumstances and pain and trauma can murky the waters. Selflessness.
Yeah. That's that'll be the thing I note down for my future. And that's
Very
why I like
good.
meeting people too. I borrow a lot of wisdom from people,
Same.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and you just note it, and it gives you perspective for, like I said, I'm 33, so when I'm 40, when I'm 50, when I'm 60, to understand like a little bit before I get to that point, what is life like at that
Yeah.
point, and what do people think about?
For sure. I gotta ask, as we're kind of getting at the end of our hour here.
Sure.
Uh, what's after 10,000?
I have an idea, so not like I have like a concept of what it will be. But I also would like to think, like, in 2015, if you're like, "What happens in 2020?" No one would have predicted what 2020 was gonna bring.
No.
But so, assuming I meet 500 people a year, I'll finish by the time I'm 40. I plan to continue speaking until the end of time, and I hope to grow in, like, my confidence as a speaker and my skill in being able to connect with audiences, and again, I'm sure you have experience with this, but I feel like I've, like, developed this mine of gold, and it's all there. It's not like having the mine is one thing. Being able to mine the gold out and deliver it to the end user in a way that's palatable is a totally other thing, and that's what I'm working on now. So I hope to continue speaking and then be at the point where when I'm 40 years old, maybe I can speak like twice a month and support myself off of that and continue to meet people. I won't have I don't intend on having any bigger goals. Sometimes people are like, "Oh, you got to go to 20,000 next." And I'm like, I don't think I have time for that. Like the years in my life, I don't know if I have it. But I think to continue meeting like one new person a day would be a practice that I would enjoy. And then I think being a professor at a university,
Mhm.
having a course for first year students, where like imagine your time at K State if you had a class first semester freshman year, where it's like this class every hour you're going to meet one other classmate of yours, and your sole goal is to share your story with them and understand theirs to the best of your ability. And then without taking notes or anything, write their story for them afterwards to show how much you listened to it. Like, imagine how much better listeners the students would be, how much better they would be at sharing their own stories, how much empathy they would have in hearing their classmates' stories, and where those relationships would go beyond the time frame of that one semester. Like, that excites me to help students with that. So I see myself speaking like twice a month, meeting like one person a day or a few people a week or whatever, being like that cool professor with a life experience at a local university, and then just putting time into wife and kids. The wife and kids will be the top priority. Like, I think I always I say my measurement of success is the amount of time I spend with the people that I care about. So I want to make sure that that's the top thing. Everything else will be like a secondary support of that. But that's, I think, the breakdown. But I also have no idea because I'm like, I could meet someone who has this business venture, and then I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I want to do afterwards.
Right.
So I have no, yeah. So we'll see.
What you just described there with your class, the ability to write somebody else's story. I had a guest on here one time, and actually wrote about it in my book. Her name's Justine Lee. She runs the group Living Room Conversations and Make America Dinner Again.
Hmm.
Um, she described to me a concept called radical empathy, where it's similar to what you just said, but rather than writing the story in the third person, so Rob enjoys this and Rob believes this, you actually deliver your summation of their experience and their life in the first person. So,
Hmm.
as Rob, I believe this. As Rob, I have experienced this in my life and it has made me feel this way. It's called radical empathy. And what
Hmm.
it does is it places you even more closely to the person that you're talking about, even if it's something you disagree with, even if it's something that you're unfamiliar with from an experience standpoint. Just the act of saying it in the first person gives you an awareness and an understanding of that person and how that might feel to be judged for their behavior or their experiences or their beliefs or their ideas. By saying it out loud, that's empathy like you would not believe.
Yeah.
That's why she calls it radical empathy.
Yeah. I like that.
It's pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, I feel like I'm learning a lot from the conversation. There's things that I will take away and implement into how I do my project.
Hey, that's awesome, man. I just the work that you're doing, it's like this show on a massive greater scale. Like I've got 121 episodes, you're 6,000 plus conversations in, and you're setting an example of what I want people to do, man. And I just I can't thank you enough for the work that you're doing, because going back to that optimism versus pessimism thing, I choose to see the world and your work in it from an optimistic viewpoint, and I think you're doing great stuff, man. So thank you for the invite to have this conversation, and thank you for allowing me to ask some questions too.
Yeah. Truly, truly a pleasure. It's always nice to meet another kindred spirit and to know that there are other people. And that's what's something that I've liked about this project is you get bubbled up into the people who care about connection in the same way. So these are some of my favorite conversations. So thank you for having me.
This conversation with Rob really brings out something I say all the time, really exemplifies something I say all the time here on this show and in conversations off air, quote unquote. And that is, if you are upset about something, if there is an issue or a challenge that you have or a disagreement that you have about something, and you don't have an actual person to go talk through that issue with or that challenge that you have, if you don't have somebody real who you can go speak to that rather than just talking about a caricature or a stereotype of someone who believes differently than you, then your bubble, your sphere around you is too small. And that is why what Rob said in his video that we discussed here, the more I interact with the depth of people, the more I acknowledge that it exists. That's another way of saying exactly that, of the outcome of that thing that I say all the time. And the two words that Rob shared really speak to what this means, how this can show up in our lives. Sonder, that every person you run into is as equally complicated and experiences a depth of life every bit as much as you do. How often do we give others that grace to know that there is a torrential swirling going on in our head and around us and in our lives full of complexity and nuance? Complexity and nuance. I said that really weird. And that every single other person is experiencing the same thing. Doesn't that require us to have a little bit of grace for each other? And then the other word that he shared, onism, how little of the world you'll actually experience. What does that mean when then we take issues and boil them down to either or us versus them, or some other form of a binary, when we ultimately have so little experience of everything that could be, of every possibility that is out there? All of these things, the depth of people that exists, the complexity that they live with every bit as much as you, and how little of the world you actually know, could be an unlock if we lean into that. If you lean into that, could be an unlock to having more grace for people and being able to lean into communication with them, to understanding with them, rather than where I think we often default, which is our own certainty about what we believe is true and right based on purely our own experience. Just reflect on that for me. I'm sure Rob would appreciate it as well. And so I want to thank Rob for joining me here on this episode of The Follow-Up Question. Fantastic mission that he is on. Go and support him. The links are in the show notes. And support this episode by helping us get the word out about our conversation here. Not only that, but the work that Rob is doing to try and get to those 10,000 conversations. Follow him on social media. Go check out his website, all that good stuff. Share this episode with your network and help us spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions and having conversations like the one that you just heard, sometimes even with complete and random strangers. If you would ever like to get in touch with me, you can always go to my website. It's michaelashford.com. You can reach out there, or you can email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com. Also on my website, you can sign up for my newsletter, and there's a lot of other resources there, so go check that out. That's michaelashford.com. That is it for this episode of The Follow-Up Question, so I'll catch you next time. And until then, keep asking questions.